Since the dawn of civilization, it can be argued that our human civilization was born out of economics.
Was just invented in a sweet dank valley right in between these two rivers, and the animals are helping. Guess what happens next? More food, and more people who came to buy the food. Now you need people to help make the food and keep track of the sales. And now you need houses for people to live in and people to make the houses. And now there's more people and they invent things, which makes things better. And more people come and there's more farming and more people to make more things for more people. And now there's business, money, writing, laws, power, society.
The people with the most resources traded with the people which they needed resources from. This saw the generation of a chain of exchange and trade throughout the world. Economics is just this, the study of the efficient allocation of resources. A good economy is something that allocates resources very well, and a bad one, well, resources go to a few people. But in modern days, it had gone further than that. Because some people started to ask, what is a good allocation of resources? And what is the bad one? Nowadays, economists and governments study economic indicators to determine the economic health of their country or the world. There are three types of economic indicators. Lagging indicators. These indicators are values that follow the economy. When the economy changes, these values change with it. The next type of indicator is leading indicators. These economic indicators are the ones that influence the change within the economy. Next is the coincidental indicators. These change with, not before or after, economic change. So, the goal of this video is to study one very important indicator of my home country, of Thailand, and to study its economic health from the year 1990 to 2019 and try to predict to a sort of reasonable prediction by using a very important indicator called the gross domestic product. GDP, or gross domestic product, measures the total market value of all consumed goods and services within a study community. We'll get to how it's calculated later, but take my word for it that a high GDP means a very good economy in most sense. There are a few exceptions, but we'll get to them later. So, we'll study first the types of GDP. This is very important when considering any graph that says that it presents GDP, because there are different types, and if you don't use them carefully, you may be tricked by the graph. The first type is nominal GDP. This is the most straightforward type. It's calculated directly and it does not adjust for other economic factors like inflation or price points. Next is the GDP with purchasing power parity, or GDP PPP. This is a special method that takes nominal GDP and pairs it with something that economics call the international dollar. It's a hypothetical currency that will tell you the economic state of a country. So, if we use GDP PPP, that means inflation, the cost of living, and different price points for each country is considered. Next is real GDP. This is similar to GDP PPP, but it only takes into account inflation and deflation. Next is GDP growth rates. This is a very big type because it depends. You can use real GDP or GDP PPP or nominal GDP to calculate GDP growth rates. But no matter it is the percentage difference compared between two measurements of GDP. Next is GDP per capita. Alike with GDP growth rate, it depends on which type of GDP you use it, but it divides the GDP of a country equally to all of its citizens, and then you study only one, the average man or woman of that country, to see how he is better off or worse than other communities. So there are three methods of calculating GDP. The first is the expenditure approach, which basically sums all the spending, all the purchasing in that country. But you don't sum the things that were imported in, because that means that would be the market value of another community. Next is the production or the output approach. This method calculates GDP by the value that you sold. So instead of the value that you bought those goods, it will be calculated as a producer. Next is the income approach. It's the middle ground between the expenditure approach and the production approach. The income approach sums all the money made, but does not take into account profits and loss, unlike the production output approach. So, in this video, I would like to point to you to two ways of analyzing GDP data. GDP data is usually released annually, sometimes quarterly, by a governing body. The first way we would like to use GDP is to use GDP per capita as a standard of living indicator. For example, if in country A, the GDP per capita is $10, and in country B, GDP per capita is $20, if you look at it at face value, you would think that country B is better off. More money spent for the average person. But there is a caveat to that. What if I say that in country B, the cost of living is 3 times that of country A? You would see that the person in country A is now massively richer when you take away the cost of living. So the most GDP used for this method is GDP PPP, because that keeps the cost of living, inflation and deflation out of the picture. You can compare it directly. Next, the second method is to use GDP growth to analyze many things. One, you can analyze how well an economy is doing. If it's expanding, that means it's going better. More people are buying, more people are spending, there's more money going around. If GDP growth is increasing, same, it's also indicative of a good economy. But not always, because if the GDP increased too much, that means it's going into inflation. Next is GDP growth decreasing. That means the economy is going into recession. As GDP is a lagging indicator, we cannot predict to certainty the future of GDP, but we can analyze the patterns that comes with it. Okay, so with the methods described, I would like to study the economy of Thailand. For those of you who don't know, Thailand is a country in Southeast Asia. It is classified by the World Bank as a middle-income country, and it's also part of the ASEAN Economic Community. The most important aspect of the Thai economy is exports and the tourist industry, which Bangkok, its capital, is the most visited city in the world. The World Bank says that Thailand is one of the great examples of success development because in the past 40 years, its economy have grown rapidly. Okay, so let's look at the graphs. First is GDP PPP per capita. We can see that throughout the years, Thais have been doing better and better, but we are just above the world average. Thai population have modest purchasing power, and the Thai GDP PPP per capita is looking to be overtaken by East Asian and Pacific countries. This is probably due to the rapid growth of the Chinese and countries like Vietnam, Laos, and of course the big economies of Taiwan, Korea, and Singapore. Next, we go to the graph of GDP growth. This one is really interesting. So we can see that the GDP growth of Thailand have 4 prominent points. 1, a record high never before seen during the 1990s. 2, at the end of the 1990s, specifically 1997 to 1998, there is a huge drop, and then another drop again in 2007 that lasted till 2009, and a further drop in 2013 and 2014. We can see that the graphs of the GDP growth of East Asia and Pacific countries closely mirror the Thai GDP growth, and the world economy to an extent have the same geometry. So we can safely assume that the Thai GDP growth follows the world trend, as we can see in the drops of 1997 to 1998, 2007 and 2009, but the special case of 2013 to 2014 was because of an internal matter, the 2014 coup. As the coup was an internal matter, it did not affect the economies of East Asia, but Thai exports suffered, and the tourist industry, due to curfews and martial law, suffered greatly. The Thai GDP growth outlook for the future looks to be heading into recession, because as we have seen, Thai GDP growth follows closely with the world one, and due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Bank warns that the 2020s, unlike the Great Depression, will be a recession. So, in conclusion, the Thai economy is an economy that is very fragile. It relies heavily on the purchasing power of other countries because its main industry are the industry of export and tourism. However, it is a fast-growing one, and it grew from a low-income to a middle-income country in just a few decades. The Thai economy is vulnerable. It follows the same trends, recessions or expansion of the world economy. On top of that, its unstable political climate has caused its economy to suffer many times. Although Thailand have fought the COVID-19 pandemic well, the repercussions of the world's economic recession will certainly be felt. Why? Well, certainly because of the drying up of tourists and less countries now relying on importing Thai food. Investors and citizens of Thailand should be very careful at this point. Thank you for listening and watching my presentation. Do subscribe to the channel and check out my research paper on the topic down below. Thank you and have a good day.